Well, let's get some more now on the latest developments around Syria. And let's speak to Jacob Hornberger, live in Washington, D.C., the head of the U.S.-based non-profit organization, the Future of Freedom Foundation. Good to see you today. The U.S. is hailing Russia's latest rhetoric on Syria, while what Moscow is saying it's just been speaking the same rhetoric all the time along. Which of the two sides do you think is more desperate for a compromise at the UN?
Well, I think it's impossible to say. Each side's trying to maintain its control over the regime, its influence over the regime. The U.S. would love to have regime change in Syria. The Russians would love to maintain the regime there. But let's face it, a ceasefire leaves the dictatorship in power. And that's exactly what these Syrian rebels would like to get rid of. So I'm not sure that really accomplishes anything with respect to what the rebels want. When they're trying to get rid of the dictatorship.
All right, well, let's address the issue of the UN Security Council. If it passes a resolution on Syria, what kind of action could we expect to see it taking with Syria?
Well, I think it depends on how the resolution is phrased, because as we've seen in the past, what the U.S. government does is it takes these what seem to be innocuous, nice-sounding resolutions and then drives a Mack truck through them and says, oh, well, this justifies military intervention, this justifies bombing attacks, no-fly zones, and so forth. I would assume that the Russians are going to be very cautious about the wording of that resolution. But I think we should keep in mind that no matter what they do with these resolutions, these interventions, they always end up with a worse situation. There's much more death and destruction and so forth if there's intervention. My position is just leave this to the Syrians to resolve. It's not a nice situation. It never is when you have a dictatorship and people are trying to oust that dictatorship, but it's best left to the people of that country to resolve. Leave the United Nations and the U.S. government out of the equation, as well as the Russian government.
Now, Germany has reiterated its stance against military intervention in Syria, as have many, many countries in the world. But why is the U.S. still refusing to take that option off the table? What is America's motivation to deposing the regime?
It's the same motivation that guides its foreign policy and has for many decades. Is regime change where the dictatorship is not a pro-U.S. regime. I mean, the U.S. likes to make the impression that it's favoring democracy, but when you look at it, they favor the military dictatorship in Egypt. That's a brutal dictatorship. They have funneled billions of dollars into there for years. In fact, let's not forget that the U.S., the CIA, used the Syrian torture regime to a rendition that Canadian citizen Mehar Arar for the purpose of torture. So they were actually employing Syria's dictatorship to torture a guy on their behalf. So that's what guides U.S. foreign policy, is getting their people into public office around the world, and it's led to the disastrous consequences we see in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere around the world where people despise the U.S. That's why some of us are saying it's time to dismantle this whole regime change foreign policy of interventionism and undeclared wars.
But one other factor that certainly many international analysts have been drawing attention to is that when it comes to Washington's motives in Syria, as you were saying earlier about forcing a regime change there are many that say, well, it's not so much about the Syrian regime, rather that Syria is more strategically important to confining and isolating Iran. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very possible, because they would love to have regime change in Iran, too. I mean, that's what they did in 1953 when the CIA engineered a coup that ousted the democratically elected prime minister of the country. I mean, the U.S. destroyed Iraq's experiment with democracy, installed a dictatorship, an unelected dictator, the Shah of Iran, trained his secret police force, the Savak, helped them torture the Iranian people. And so now that resulted in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, an anti-U.S. regime, and so the U.S. has never forgotten that. That's what the whole Iranian foreign policy is surrounding around, is how do we affect regime change in Iran? And certainly Syria may be part of that equation.
Now, there are certainly many reports that suggest that the Syrian opposition is fragmented at the moment, with several umbrella groups seemingly competing for control. Tell us this, how exactly, or who exactly, is the Assad government supposed to negotiate with, whereas there's the guarantee that all rebel forces will stick to whatever agreements are brokered here. It certainly seems there's infighting factions that all call themselves part of the resistance.
Well, that's the part that comes with a revolution or a civil war, is that the whole thing becomes very messy. I mean, Jefferson pointed out in our Declaration of Independence that people will put up with a lot of tyranny before they finally revolt, because there's so much death and destruction, and the end game is never clear. And so people should move very cautiously before they take up arms against their own government. But you've got this brutal dictatorship. It will not stand for elections or fair elections. And so if people want to oust a dictatorship, the only way they can do that is with violence. How does this all get resolved? It's impossible to say. I mean, it's like riding a wild tiger. You don't know where it's going to end up. It's impossible to say how this is going to end up.
Jacob Hornberger, the head of the US-based non-profit organization, the Future of Freedom Foundation, live for us in Washington, D.C. Many thanks indeed for coming on RT.
Oh, you're welcome.